She was on her knees scrubbing someone else's filth when the whole town decided she was nothing. Clara Bennett had learned long ago that a woman her size, in a town like Harrow Creek, Montana, was never allowed to forget what she was. Too much, too heavy, too broken to matter. Every morning she rose before the sun. Every night she fell into a bed that smelled like lye soap and exhaustion. She did it for June. She did it for Millie. She did it because the alternative was surrender, and Clara Bennett had not yet learned how to surrender. Then Rowan Cade walked into Pruitt's trading post, and everything changed. If this story reaches your heart, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. The water in the bucket had gone gray and cold an hour ago. Clara Bennett knew this the way she knew most things about her life. Not by checking, not by measuring, but simply by feel. The ache in her knees told her she had been down on this floor too long. The sting behind her eyes told her she was close to something she refused to call crying. And the cold, dirty water soaking through the rags wrapped around her hands told her that Emmett Pruitt had not bothered to replace the bucket since morning, which meant she had been scrubbing Pruitt's trading post floor with the same dark water for going on 3 hours. She did not complain. Complaining was a luxury that belonged to women who had options. Clara had 2 daughters, a dead husband's debt, and a landlord who charged her rent and labor because he claimed she had nothing worth taking in coin. She had learned to keep her head down, her hands moving, and her mouth shut, because the one time she had spoken back to Emmett Pruitt, the one time, 6 months after Thomas died and she was still raw and disoriented with grief, he had docked her 2 weeks of wages and told the whole of Harrow Creek that the Bennett widow had an attitude problem to match her figure. That was how things were said in Harrow Creek. That was the language people used. Clara had never been a small woman. Not before Thomas, not during their marriage, and certainly not after, when grief and exhaustion, and the particular cruelty of surviving on cornmeal and dried beans had padded her body in ways that small-minded people found permission to discuss openly, as though her body were public property and her feelings were an inconvenience too minor to consider. She was broad-shouldered and round-hipped, and her hands were large and capable of things most of the men in Harrow Creek couldn't manage: chopping wood, hauling water uphill, mending fences in a Montana November with wind coming off the mountains like a punishment. But capability, she had learned, counted for nothing when you looked the way she looked and carried the name of a dead man whose debts were still living. You missed a spot. Clara did not look up. She knew the voice. She had memorized it the way you memorize a sound that precedes pain. Emmett Pruitt, 53 years old, wide-bodied himself, though nobody seemed to find that worth mentioning, with a gray-streaked beard and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him. "Where?" she said. Flat, neutral, the voice she had trained herself to use. "Right there." He pointed with the toe of his boot to a patch of floor directly in front of where she was already kneeling. "Looks like you smeared it more than cleaned it. That what I'm paying you for? Smearing?" There were 2 men standing at the counter behind him, Holt Greer and his cousin Davis, both ranch hands from the alderman spread north of town. They were watching with the mild interest of men who found other people's humiliation entertaining. "I'll get it," Clara said. "You'll get it," Pruitt repeated, in the tone he used when he was about to say something he wanted an audience for. "You know what your problem is, Clara. You take up a lot of space in this world, but you don't do a lot of good in it. You understand what I mean by that?" Holt Greer made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Davis studied the ceiling. Clara dipped the rag into the cold gray water and wrung it out. Her jaw was tight. The space behind her sternum was the particular kind of hollow that comes not from hunger, but from years of swallowing things that deserve to be said out loud. "I understand," she said. She did not look up because she knew if she looked up, she would say something, and if she said something, she would lose the last thin arrangement that was keeping her daughters fed. June was 9. Millie was 6. June had Thomas's eyes, and Millie had Thomas's stubbornness, and both of them were waiting at Mrs. Hatch's boarding house right now, sharing a single wool blanket and a dinner plate that Clara had not yet earned today. That was the math. That was always the math. Clara's dignity on one side, her daughter's dinner on the other. Dinner won. Dinner always won. "Got a delivery order," Pruitt said, losing interest in her now that she hadn't fought back. He moved toward the counter. "Cade order. Somebody ride it up the mountain tomorrow. Not you," he added. without looking back. "I need you here." She heard Holt Greer say something to Davis in a low voice. She heard the word mountain. She heard the name Cade said the way people always said it in Harrow Creek, with a kind of uneasy respect that bordered on fear. She had heard of Rowan Cade the way most people in town had heard of him, in pieces, at a distance, the way you hear about weather that hasn't reached you yet. He'd bought the old Hargrove homestead up in the high country 3 years back. Kept to himself. Came to town maybe 4 times a year. Tall, people said. Quiet. The kind of quiet Holt Greer's wife had once said to Mrs. Hatch in Clara's hearing that made a person wonder what was underneath it. Clara wrung out her rag again and moved to the next section of floor. The bell above the trading post door rang at 4:30. Clara was on her feet by then, restocking the dry goods shelf along the back wall, moving cans of lard and sacks of dried corn with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had learned to keep her body useful and her mind somewhere quieter. The shelf was high on one side and she had to stretch, her arm extended, her back to the door, when she heard the particular silence that fell over Pruitt's store. Not the normal silence of a slow afternoon. Something different. The kind that meant someone had walked in who changed the air. She turned. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the stories, though she hadn't realized she'd assembled any specific expectation. 6 feet and something more. Lean through the shoulders in a way that suggested work rather than leisure, wearing a heavy canvas coat dark with trail dust and a hat that had seen at least one hard winter. His face was angular, weathered, maybe 35, maybe 40. The kind of face that the mountains make when they get hold of a man young and keep him. Dark eyes that moved over the room once, quickly, and then settled. Emmett Pruitt came out from behind the counter with a different posture than the one he'd had an hour ago. "Mr. Cade," he said, "didn't expect you down till next week." "Came early," Rowan Cade said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Order ready?" "Just about. Got it pulled in back." "My girl here can—" Pruitt glanced toward Clara, and there was already something mean gathering in his expression, the way meanness gathers when an audience presents itself. "Actually, let me handle that myself. Clara, you can get back to what you were doing." Clara turned back to the shelf. She heard Pruitt moving toward the back room. She heard Holt Greer say something to Davis again, low. She reached for another can of lard and stretched up toward the high shelf, and the hem of her skirt caught on the corner of a lower shelf, and she shifted her weight wrong, and the stack of cans on the upper shelf, 4 of them, heavy, poorly balanced, came down. One struck her shoulder, 2 hit the floor with a sound like small cannon fire. The 4th caught the edge of the shelf on the way down and sent a cascade of smaller tins scattering across the boards in every direction. For a moment there was complete silence. Then Holt Greer laughed. Davis laughed. From somewhere in the back room, Emmett Pruitt's voice came clearly. "What in the hell?" Clara crouched to gather the cans. Her face was hot. Her shoulder hurt. She reached for the nearest tin, and her hair came loose from its pin and fell across her face, and she pushed it back with a hand that was shaking slightly, though she could not have said whether from pain or embarrassment or the particular exhaustion of being someone whose small disasters were always witnessed. "I've got it," she said to no one in particular. "I've got it. It's fine." "Leave it." She looked up. Rowan Cade was crouching beside her. He had moved from the doorway without her hearing him, or maybe she'd been too occupied with the humiliation to notice. He was picking up cans with large, unhurried hands, setting them in a neat row along the edge of the shelf, not looking at her and not looking away from her, occupying some middle distance that felt, somehow, like courtesy. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said. He set the last 2 cans on the shelf and stood, and held down his hand. Clara looked at it. She could not remember the last time someone had held a hand down to her. Not in assistance, in simple human acknowledgement. The gesture was so ordinary and so foreign at the same time that she had to remind herself to take it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go the moment she was steady. Emmett Pruitt came back from the storeroom with a crate in his arms and stopped short at the scene in front of him. Clara standing, Cade standing beside her, the shelf reassembled. "There a problem?" Pruitt said. "No," Cade said. Pruitt set the crate on the counter and began reciting the contents. Clara moved back toward the dry goods shelf and kept her hands busy and did not look at Rowan Cade again. or tried not to. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a fire in a cold room, peripherally, gratefully, and with a wariness you can't quite explain. She was reaching for the top shelf again when she heard Pruitt say, in the casual way he had of detonating things, "Oh, speaking of, Clara, I'm going to need you to work Sunday. You've got that debt balance still outstanding." She stopped moving. "We settled that," she said, carefully. "I worked the extra days last month. You said—" "I said maybe." Pruitt's voice had an edge of enjoyment in it. "Bookkeeping's not your strong suit, Clara. Shouldn't surprise you considering—" He looked toward Cade, including him in the joke. "Woman can't add up her own accounts. Expects me to keep track for her." "I have a record," Clara said. Her voice was still controlled, but something had cracked slightly beneath the surface, and she could hear it. "I keep a record. The debt was—" "The debt is what I say it is," Pruitt said. "That's how it works when somebody else is carrying you. You understand that? Now don't make a scene." The words "make a scene" landed the way they were meant to, as a reminder that she had an audience, that making a scene would embarrass her, that her best protection was silence. She closed her mouth. Her hands, at her sides, had curled into fists. "How much?" The question came from Rowan Cade. His voice was the same as it had been, low, unhurried, carrying no particular heat. He was looking at Pruitt. Pruitt blinked. "Pardon?" "The debt." Cade's eyes moved to Clara once, briefly, then back to Pruitt. "How much does she owe?" There was a pause. Pruitt did the thing that small men do when they're suddenly uncertain. He reassembled his authority like a jacket he'd nearly let fall. "That's a private arrangement between me and—" "Name a figure." The words were quiet. They were not loud, not aggressive, not particularly dramatic. But something in the room shifted in the way a room shifts when the largest presence in it decides to occupy itself fully. Holt Greer had gone very still. Davis was looking at the counter. Even the ordinary sounds of the street outside seemed to pull back slightly, as if listening. Pruitt named a figure. Cade reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a leather wallet and counted out bills onto the counter. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular deliberateness of a man who is making a point without raising his voice. When he was done, he laid the last bill flat and looked at Pruitt. "That covers it," he said. It was not a question. Pruitt stared at the money. His face had gone through several colors in quick succession and had settled somewhere between pale and furious. "This isn't your business," he said. "Her debt, her—" "She's done here," Cade said. He looked at Clara. "If you want." Clara stood very still. The trading post was quiet in a way it had never been quiet during all the months she'd spent on her knees on its floor. Holt Greer and Davis were looking at their boots. Emmett Pruitt was looking at the money on his counter with an expression that suggested he wanted to refuse it and couldn't find the mechanism to do so. And Rowan Cade was looking at her, not with pity, not with the particular softness people sometimes put on when they wanted to be thanked for something, just looking at her. Steady, like a man who had asked a question and was genuinely waiting for the answer. "If you want," 2 words, 3 syllables. And yet they contained something Clara had not been offered in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. A choice. Not a command, not a condition, not the implication that she owed gratitude before she'd agreed to anything. Just a question, just her own will returned to her. "I have daughters," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. 2 girls. They're at the boarding house. "We can get them," Cade said. "I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know what you're offering." "Work," he said. "Legitimate work. My homestead needs a cook and someone who can manage a house. I've got a spare room for you and your girls. It's not easy country up there, but it's honest work and you'd be paid for it." He paused. "You'd be paid for it," he repeated, as if he understood that this part specifically needed to be said twice. Clara looked at Pruitt. She looked at the gray water in the bucket by the far wall. She looked at her own hands, red from the cold, rough from years of other people's labor, still slightly shaking. She thought about June and Millie in the boarding house, sharing a blanket, doing sums in a composition book because she'd told them education mattered even when everything else was uncertain. "All right," she said. Mrs. Hatch's boarding house was a narrow two-story frame building on the west end of Harrow Creek's main street, wedged between a smithy and an empty lot that had never been built on, as though the town itself had been uncertain about that particular stretch of ground. Clara walked quickly, and Rowan Cade walked beside her, and neither of them spoke for most of the block and a half it took to get there. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said finally. "I know. Pruitt will be ugly about it. He'll tell people what he wants," Cade said. "That's his nature. It doesn't change what happened." Clara glanced at him sideways. Up close and moving, he was different than he'd seemed in the store. Less like a piece of weather and more like a person, though not in any way that made him less difficult to read. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time squinting into distance. His jaw was clean-shaved, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected a beard in keeping with the rest of the wild country impression he gave. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question as though it deserved consideration rather than a quick answer. "I've seen men like Pruitt before," he said. "I don't like watching it." "That's not—" She stopped. "That's not all of it. You offered work. You didn't have to do that part." They had reached Mrs. Hatch's door. Cade stopped and looked at her. There was something in his expression that was almost uncomfortable. Not embarrassed exactly, but honest in a way that sat close to discomfort. "I needed somebody," he said. "I've been needing somebody for 2 winters. I put it off because finding the right arrangement is harder than it sounds, and I wasn't—" He stopped himself. "My homestead runs better with more than one person managing it. That's a practical fact. You look like someone who knows how to work." "I'm also fat," Clara said, flatly, "just in case that's going to be a problem later." He looked at her. There was a pause. "All right," he said, as if she'd told him something unremarkable. "You're also fat." She stared at him. "That going to be a problem for you?" he said. She almost laughed, caught herself, and then thought, when was the last time something almost made you laugh? She couldn't remember. "No," she said. "Then it's not a problem," Cade said, and opened the boarding house door for her. June Bennett did not trust easily. This was something she had inherited not from Thomas, who had been a gentle and trusting man to his detriment, but from some older, harder vein in the family line that had passed directly into her small, serious face and her careful dark eyes. At 9 years old, she had the bearing of someone who had been disappointed by adults enough times to approach each new one with a preliminary assessment. She stood in the doorway of Mrs. Hatch's front room and looked at Rowan Cade the way a sheriff looks at a stranger riding into town. "Who's this?" she said. "Mr. Cade," Clara said. "We're going to go work at his homestead for a while." "His homestead," June said, with a particular emphasis on the his that made it clear she had processed the potential complications of this arrangement more thoroughly than most adults would have expected. "Yes." "Do we have a choice?" Clara looked at her daughter. At the serious face, the Thomas eyes, the slight lift of the chin that June used when she was ready to argue. "We do," she said. "We can stay here." June looked at the room. It was small and cold, and the wallpaper was peeling at one corner, and the window let in a draft that Mrs. Hatch had never gotten around to fixing. Then she looked at Rowan Cade. "Are you mean?" she said. Cade met her eyes without flinching, which Clara noted. A lot of people flinched at June when she was in this mode. "Not particularly," he said. "My mama's not someone you can push around," June said, "in case you were thinking about it." "I wasn't," he said. "Also, Millie sleeps with a bear," June said. "It's a stuffed bear. She can't sleep without it. If that's a problem, we should know now." "It's not a problem," Cade said. June considered him for another moment, head slightly tilted. Then she turned and called over her shoulder, "Millie, get your bear!" They left Harrow Creek as the afternoon light was failing. The 3 of them bundled in the bed of Cade's wagon while he drove from the front. Millie had fallen asleep against Clara's arm before they cleared the edge of town. The stuffed bear clutched to her chest, her dark hair loose across Clara's shoulder. June sat upright on the other side, watching the town recede with an expression that Clara recognized, the particular face of someone who is trying to decide whether leaving is hope or foolishness. Clara watched the mountains. She had been born in eastern Montana, flat country, horizon country, where the sky takes up more room than the land. She had come to Harrow Creek with Thomas 8 years ago and had never gone further west, never gone up into the high country that loomed above the town like a permanent suggestion. Up there the peaks were already holding snow, white against the last of the day's blue, and the pines were dark and thick and close, and the road Cade was driving them up was the kind of road that required belief. You couldn't see where it went, you just had to trust that it continued. She thought about Empet Pruitt's face when Cade laid the last bill on the counter. She thought about the words "you'd be paid for it," said twice. She thought about the moment in the store when Cade had held his hand down to her, not grabbing, not pulling, just offering, and how long it had taken her to remember that she was allowed to take it. Millie shifted in her sleep and made a small sound, and Clara pulled her closer and felt the familiar weight of her, the specific gravity of her child, the one thing in the world that had kept Clara's feet on the ground through every bad season, and thought, whatever this is, we go carefully. We go with our eyes open, but we go. The wagon moved up into the mountains. The last of the town lights disappeared behind the trees, and Clara Bennett, for the first time in a very long time, did not know what was coming next, and found to her own surprise that the not knowing felt almost like something she could breathe in, almost in the cold pine-scented dark, like possibility. The homestead appeared out of the trees like something that had been there long before the trees themselves, a long, low house built from hand-cut logs, a barn set back at a practical distance, a fence line running in both directions into the dark. There was a light in the window, a real light, lamp-lit and warm, the kind that suggested someone lived there, not just occupied it, but lived in the full sense that word contains. Cade pulled the wagon around to the side of the house and set the brake and climbed down without ceremony. "Main house," he said. "Your room's on the north side. Small, but it'll hold a bed and something extra. I put a second mattress in there this afternoon when I came down, in case—" He stopped, recalculated. "I expected I might come back with more than just supplies." Clara, lifting the sleeping Millie carefully from the wagon bed, paused. "You expected this?" Something shifted briefly in his expression. Not quite embarrassment, not quite admission. "I expected something like it," he said. "Pruitt's been running that arrangement for too long." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. June climbed down from the wagon on her own and stood looking at the house with the critical assessment of someone deciding whether to invest belief. "It's bigger than it looks," June said, which was the highest compliment she appeared to offer. Cade pushed open the front door. Inside, it was warm. A banked fire in the stone hearth, a table large enough for four, a kitchen that had clearly been arranged by someone who thought about practical use rather than appearance. There were shelves built into every wall, tools, books, jars of preserved goods, and everything was worn and deliberate in the way of things that have been used hard for useful purposes. Clara stood in the middle of it, Millie heavy and warm in her arms, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she needed a moment to identify it. Safe. Not permanently safe, not irrevocably safe, but safe tonight, in this moment, in this room, a fire, a roof, walls that held the cold outside where it belonged. "Breakfast at 6, Cade said, already moving back toward the door to unload the wagon. "I'll show you the cook stove in the morning. Sleep well." He went out. Clara stood a moment longer. Then she carried Millie to the north room, and June followed, and she settled her daughters under a quilt that smelled like cedar and clean air. And she sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and held her own hands in her lap and listened to the wind against the logs. Outside, she could hear Cade moving in the barn, the steady sound of it, purposeful, unhurried, real. She did not cry. She had made it a practice not to cry over things that were still uncertain. But she sat in the dark a long time, and she breathed, and she let herself feel the warmth, and she thought, whatever he gets out of this arrangement, at least for tonight, my daughters are warm. That was enough. That, for now, was enough. The cold came down from the peaks that first night like a living thing. Not the damp, indifferent cold of the valley town, but something with intention behind it. Something that pressed against the log walls of the homestead and searched for gaps with patient, probing fingers. Clara lay awake in the north room listening to it, and listening to her daughters breathe, and listening to the distant, occasional sounds from the barn that told her Rowan Cade was still moving around in the dark. She had not slept easily in 2 years. Sleep required a certain loosening, a certain willingness to let go of the watch she kept over everything, and Clara had not been able to afford that loosening since Thomas died, and the whole architecture of their life had come down at once. Tonight was no different in that regard. Her mind stayed active and restless, cataloging the new sounds of this new place, mapping the distances between things, assembling what she knew about the man who had brought them here, which was not much. He'd paid her debt without being asked. He'd offered work with terms that were clear and fair, spoken plainly, and repeated when they needed repeating. He'd opened a door for her without making a ceremony of it, and he'd looked at June's interrogation with something close to respect, and he'd said not a problem about Millie's bear without a trace of condescension. These were small things. Clara knew better than to build a house out of small things before you checked the foundation, but she noted them. She kept a careful accounting. She fell asleep somewhere past midnight to the sound of the wind and woke at 5:15 by the particular quality of the dark, which had shifted from deep black to something thinner, more provisional. She dressed quietly, not waking the girls, and found the kitchen by memory. She had only walked through it once, but she was good with the geography of spaces, always had been, and stood at the cook stove for a moment, figuring out its mechanics before she had it lit and the coffee water on. She was slicing salt pork when Cade came in from outside, already dressed for the cold, his coat dark with morning air. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the lit stove and the coffee pot, and Clara at the work table with a knife in her hand. Something moved briefly across his face, not surprise exactly, more like something being confirmed. "You didn't have to start," he said. "You said breakfast at 6, she said. "It's 5:40. "I meant I'd manage." "I know what you meant." She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way she said most things now. Level, matter of fact, keeping the temperature of the room even. "I'm not a guest, Mr. Cade. You said that yourself. We work for what we get here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came the rest of the way inside and hung his coat on the peg by the door and moved to the basin to wash his hands. "There's a system to the stove," he said. "The left damper runs hotter than the right. For baking you want—" "I figured it out." Another pause. "All right," he said. They worked in parallel for a while without speaking, she at the stove, he checking something at the back of the kitchen she hadn't gotten to yet, a pantry shelf she'd need to learn. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was functional, and Clara had learned that functional silence was a form of respect between people who didn't yet know each other's patterns. "How long have you been up here alone?" she asked, when the coffee was ready, and she poured 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one. He took the cup. 3 winters. Before that? He wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the light was coming up slowly, gray and cold, the mountains visible now against the sky. "Before that, I was somewhere else," he said. "Kansas, for a while. Before that, further south." He paused. None of it took. She understood that kind of answer. The kind that says, "This is the short version and I'm offering it honestly, but I'm not ready for the long version." She had that kind of answer herself. She'd been giving it to people for 2 years. "The girls will want to help," she said. "June especially. She'll offer before you ask and she'll be insulted if you say no." "I won't say no." "Millie's younger. She's tougher than she looks, but she startles easy. Loud noises, sudden things." Clara kept her voice even. "Thomas, her father, he wasn't a violent man, but the way he died was loud." She was there. Cade was quiet. "I'm telling you so you know," Clara said. "Not so you feel sorry for her." "I don't feel sorry for her," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." She looked at him then, directly, for the first time that morning. He was looking back at her with those dark, steady eyes that she still couldn't fully read. Not because they were closed or hidden, but because they were patient in a way she wasn't accustomed to. Most people's eyes wanted something. His seemed content to simply observe. "Why did you really do it?" she said. "Yesterday, the debt." He set down his cup. "I told you." "You told me part of it." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I've seen that look before," he said. "The one a person gets when they've been told often enough that they're nothing. It starts to stick. They stop fighting it." He picked up his cup again. "I didn't want to watch it stick on you." Clara held her coffee with both hands and looked at the window and did not say anything. "That offend you?" he said. No, she said. It's honest. I can work with honest. The sound of small feet on the floorboards saved them both from whatever came next. Millie, appearing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with the stuffed bear under one arm and her dark hair standing up on one side, blinking at the lit kitchen with the particular wonder of a 6-year-old who has not yet decided whether a new place is safe. Her eyes found Clara first, which was always the sequence. Locate Mama, then assess everything else. You're up, Millie said, in a tone suggesting this was marginally acceptable. I'm up, Clara said. Come here. Millie came and pressed herself against Clara's hip in the automatic way of small children, and then looked up at Rowan Cade from this position of security and regarded him for a long, considering moment. You have a big house, Millie said. It's a regular house, Cade said. Our last house was smaller. Most things are smaller than a mountain. Millie processed this. Do you have animals? Some. What kind? Horses. A mule? Chickens in the back? There was a dog, but she died last spring. Millie's face went solemn. What was her name? Ruth. That's a good name, Millie said with great seriousness. Ruth is a good name for a dog. Something moved in Cade's expression. Not quite a smile. More like the thing a face does when it is remembering how to get there. I thought so too, he said. But the days found their shape quickly, the way days do when work demands it. Clara learned the homestead in sections. The kitchen first, then the larder, and the root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house, where the preserved goods lived in the particular cold that kept things through a Montana winter. She learned the woodpile and the water situation, which involved a spring-fed trough uphill that ran clean even in hard cold but needed monitoring when temperatures dropped severe. She learned the barn's logic. Cade kept 2 horses, a plow-built roan he called Sutter, and a younger gray mare with no name that he referred to only as the mare, as if naming her was a commitment he wasn't ready to make. She doesn't have a name, June said on the 3rd morning, standing at the barn door with her arms crossed in the manner she had adopted as her standard stance for situations she found philosophically unsatisfactory. She does fine without one, Cade said, without looking up from the stall he was mucking. Everything needs a name, June said. A name is how you know something's real. He did look up then. His expression was the careful, neutral one Clara had started to recognize, the one that meant he was taking something seriously that he might have dismissed from someone else. What would you call her? June considered. Pearl, she said. She's gray like a pearl. He looked at the mare. The mare looked back with the mild indifference of horses. Pearl, he said, as if testing the weight of it. All right. June looked satisfied. Clara, carrying a bucket of water past the barn door, caught the tail end of the exchange and filed it away in the careful accounting she was keeping. The work was hard, harder than the trading post, harder than the boarding house chores, harder than anything Clara had done that was domestic rather than manual labor. The homestead at altitude in late autumn required constant maintenance, firewood split and stacked before the serious cold arrived, game to be smoked and put by, the root cellar inventoried against the months when the passes would close, and there would be no getting to town for anything. Cade worked without stopping from before dawn to after dark, and he did not ask Clara or the girls to match his pace, but he also didn't apologize for the pace the land demanded. He showed her things without making a production of it, how the smokehouse worked, how to read the weather signs on the peaks, which pass closed first, and which trail stayed passable longest. He told her once and expected her to remember, which she always did, and he said nothing when she started anticipating things before he asked. He seemed to register this as a fact, the way he registered most things, quietly, without comment, folding it into his ongoing calculation of the world. Clara watched him with her daughters. She watched carefully, because this was the thing that mattered most. Not how he treated her, but how he was with June and Millie, because that was the measure of a man that couldn't be faked for long. With Millie, he was careful in the specific, thoughtful way she'd asked for. No sudden movements near her, no raised voice. When a log shifted in the fireplace one evening and made a sharp crack and Millie flinched hard and dropped her spoon, Cade simply reached over and picked up the spoon and handed it back and said, in a tone as ordinary as weather, "Logs do that. Green wood, mostly. The dry stuff's quieter." Giving her information instead of attention. A small thing. But Clara noticed, and she thought, he heard me. He actually heard me. With June, it was different. June required a particular kind of engagement, a willingness to be questioned and to answer plainly, and Cade provided this without apparent effort. June had begun asking him things on the third day as if testing the limits of his patience, and by the fifth day seemed to have determined that the limits were either very far or did not exist. She asked about the mountains, about tracking, about what the various animal signs in the snow meant, about how he'd learned to build the smokehouse, and whether he'd done it wrong the first time. "I did it wrong the first time," he confirmed. "What did you do wrong?" "Draft was off. Filled up with smoke, and I lost 2 weeks of venison." June nodded, as if this was a satisfying and instructive answer. "Mama's good at figuring out what she did wrong," she said. "She just doesn't like admitting it in front of people." "June," Clara said from across the room. "It's true," June said reasonably. Cade glanced at Clara. His expression was very carefully neutral, but something around the corners of it suggested that he was internally more amused than he was showing. "That's so," he said. "I admit things," Clara said. "I simply prefer to admit them in my own time." "At length," June said. "You're going to bed early tonight," Clara said. November deepened. The first serious snow came on a Tuesday, and it came the way serious things in Montana come. Without a great deal of announcement, a gray morning turning white by 10 o'clock and staying that way. The flakes not the soft decorative kind, but dense, purposeful, accumulating fast against the base of the fence posts and the base of the house walls. Clara stood on the porch and watched it, and felt something tighten in her chest. "It'll stop by nightfall," Cade said behind her. She turned. He had come out of the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder, hat pulled low against the snow. "And if it doesn't?" "Then it doesn't stop by nightfall." He said it without irony. "The house holds. The larder's full. We're fine." She watched him cross the yard, the snow already thick on his shoulders, moving through it with a steadiness that had nothing of bravado and nothing of fear, just the matter-of-fact competence of a man who had made his peace with the land's terms. She thought about the boarding house. She thought about Mrs. Hatch's draft window. She thought about Millie sleeping in her coat because there wasn't enough wood for the small iron stove in the room to make it through the night. She went inside and started on lunch. The snow did stop by nightfall, and the morning after was the kind of morning that Montana winter produces occasionally. A cold, bright, almost savage beauty. The snow on the peaks lit pink at the edges, the sky a blue that had nothing to do with warmth but was beautiful anyway. Millie went outside and stood in the yard with her head tipped back and her arms out and her breath making clouds in the air and said, "Oh," in a tone that Clara had not heard from her in a long time. That simple, undefended sound of a child receiving something wonderful. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her daughter stand in the snow with her arms open and felt something shift in her chest, something that had been compressed for so long that it had almost stopped trying to expand. "She all right?" Cade said beside her. "She's fine," Clara said. Her voice was slightly not her own. "She's better than fine." He looked at Millie for a moment, then at Clara. He did not say anything else, and she was grateful for that, for the instinct that sometimes the best thing a person can offer is to stand quietly beside you while you feel something. The rhythms of the place worked on Clara in ways she hadn't anticipated. Hard work, she had always known. She was not afraid of labor or of the specific aches that accompany it. But the work here was different from the work at Pruitt's, different in the way that a thing done for yourself is different from a thing done for someone who wants to diminish you while doing it. Here she moved through the house and the yard and the root cellar with the particular freedom of someone who is contributing to something rather than simply servicing someone else's contempt. She cooked well. She had always cooked well. It was one of the things she had known about herself even through the worst years. And the first time she put a proper dinner on the table at Cade's homestead, a venison stew with the last of the autumn root vegetables and cornbread from the stone-ground meal in the larder, she watched him eat 2 full bowls in silence and felt a satisfaction that was entirely its own. "Good," he said. It was not elaborate praise. It was not performed. It was the word good used as a simple fact, and somehow that was better. "Thomas always said I cooked too much for 3 people, she said, not planning to. Cade looked at her. 3 people is fine, he said. 4 is fine too. She cleaned up and the girls went to bed, and the house settled into the quiet it made at night. The fire breathing, the wind outside finding its rhythm against the logs, the particular creak of the boards in the front room that she had already learned to read like a language. She had started to notice things about him. Small things, the kind that accumulate before you realize they're accumulating. He left the barn door open 3 inches even in cold, because one of the horses, Sutter, the older roan, was prone to anxiety in a sealed space. He kept a second lamp always filled and ready near the back door, because he'd once been caught in a sudden dark by a failed primary lamp and learned from it. He had books, more books than she'd expected, arranged on the built-in shelves not decoratively but in the manner of books that had been read, with broken spines and occasional pages that had been folded at corners and then flattened again. History, mostly. Some natural science. One volume of poetry so worn its title was illegible on the spine. She pulled it out one evening when he was in the barn and June and Millie were asleep, and she had half an hour of firelight for herself. It was Whitman. Leaves of Grass, the spine read when she angled it into the light. The pages had that particular softness of a book that has been opened and closed many hundreds of times. She put it back. When he came in from the barn, she was at the table with her own mending, and she said without looking up, "You read Whitman." He stopped at the basin to wash his hands. "Sometimes." "I wouldn't have guessed that." "What would you have guessed?" She considered. "Something more practical." "Whitman's practical," he said. He dried his hands and moved to the chair on the other side of the fire. The distance between them was correct, the proper distance of 2 people who were learning each other carefully. He writes about actual things, dirt and bodies and labor. The part people think is poetry is just what's underneath the practical. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "You've thought about that," she said. "I've had 3 winters up here alone," he said. "You think about things." She looked back down at her mending. "What else do you think about?" The question came out more open than she'd intended, more genuinely curious, less defended. She felt him notice the register of it, though he didn't look at her. "Whether I got it right," he said, "coming up here. Whether this is what I was supposed to make of myself, or whether it's just what I made because I ran out of other options." He paused. "Most days I think it is the right thing. Some days I'm less certain." Clara pulled her needle through the cloth. "Thomas thought we were supposed to go west," she said, "that it was the right direction. He died heading toward it." "What do you think?" "I think west is just a direction," she said. "The meaning is what you put on it yourself." She looked up, found him looking at her this time. "This place is good," she said. "Whatever the reason you came here, the place itself is good. I can feel it." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'm glad you can," he said. December arrived with a seriousness that changed the texture of everything. The passes closed, which Cade had predicted, and the homestead became its own contained world. The mountains on 3 sides, the long slope down to the valley on the 4th, and between them and any other human life, some 8 miles of trail that was now under 3 feet of snow. Clara had expected this to feel like being trapped. It did not. It felt strangely like relief. She and Millie began spending mornings in the kitchen together, a ritual that assembled itself without being designed. Millie would sit on the high stool at the work table and hand Clara things when asked, and carry on a continuous winding conversation about whatever was in her head. The horses, the chickens, what Ruth the dog might have looked like, whether bears dreamed during hibernation, whether the mountain had a name besides just the mountain. "Mr. Cade probably knows," Millie said one morning, handing over a jar of preserved apples. "Then ask Mr. Cade," Clara said. "He's in the barn." "He'll come in for lunch." Millie considered. "Mama," she said in the specific tone that meant a question was being assembled. "Do you like Mr. Cade?" Clara turned from the stove. "I think he's a decent man." "That's not the same as liking." "Where did you learn that distinction?" "June," Millie said. "June says you can think someone's decent and still not like them. She says you think Mr. Alderman is decent." "Mr. Alderman helps old women across icy streets and cheats at cards," Clara said. "They're not the same kind of decent." "But do you like Mr. Cade?" Clara looked at her daughter's face, round and earnest and waiting, the the stuffed bear propped against the side of the flour canister as if it too were interested in the answer. "I'm starting to," Clara said finally. "I think I'm starting to." Millie seemed to find this entirely satisfactory. She handed over the next jar without being asked. The afternoon that changed something between them was not dramatic, in the way that the most important afternoons rarely are. Kate had been cutting timber at the far edge of the property, a 2-day job he'd put off until December when the tree sap was down, and on the second day he'd come back at mid-afternoon with a cut along his left forearm that he was carrying like it didn't concern him, which it clearly should have. Clara saw it when he came through the door and set the axe against the wall. "Sit down," she said. He looked at the cut with the assessment of a man who has been his own medical care for 3 years. "It's not—" "Sit down, Rowan." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it. Him with a slight stillness, her with a slight awareness of her own voice, as if she'd heard herself from outside. He sat. She got the medicine box from the shelf and boiled water and came to the table with clean cloth and the bottle of carbolic, and he let her work without protest, which she suspected was unusual for him. He held his arm steady while she cleaned the cut. It was deep enough to need careful attention, but not so deep as to require stitching, a judgment call she made with the confidence of a woman who had been her household's practical doctor for years. "You should be more careful," she said. Axe slipped on a knot. "I know what happened. You should be more careful." "Yes," he said. She wrapped the arm with the clean cloth and tied it off and looked up to find him watching her face with that particular patient attention. They were close, the working proximity of a person tending to another, closer than they'd been except in passing, and she was suddenly aware of it. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Some." "You weren't going to say anything, were you?" It was not entirely a question. He answered it anyway. "I usually manage." "Usually managing alone is a habit," Clara said. "You've got people in the house now." She heard herself say it and felt the weight of the word people. Not employees, not a temporary arrangement, but something she was claiming as real. She didn't take it back. "If you're hurt, you say something. I'm asking that as a condition." "A condition," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. His expression had the quality it sometimes had, of processing something carefully, like a man who is not accustomed to being asked to need things. "All right," he said. "That's fair?" She put the medicine box back on the shelf. She stood at the shelf with her back to him for a moment, straightening things that didn't need straightening, giving them both time to return to ordinary breathing. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was still at the table, the wrapped arm in front of him, looking at her with an expression that was more open than any she had yet seen from him. Still not full, still held back by whatever instinct had trained him into privacy, but open in a way that felt like an offering. "I didn't do it out of pity," he said, "at Pruitt's. I want to be clear about that." "You said that." "I know I said it. I want to make sure you believe it." She looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, and the way he'd said you'd be paid for it twice, and the way he'd answered June's interrogation without flinching, and the way he'd handed back the spoon to Millie and given her information instead of sympathy. She thought about the Whitman on the shelf and the unnamed mare, and the way he moved through his own place with the unhurried care of a man who had thought carefully about what he was doing and why. "I'm starting to," she said. "Believe it." Something in him settled. Not visibly. He didn't move, didn't change posture. But the room felt different, as though something that had been held at a slight tension had been allowed to release. "Good," he said, and it was the same word he'd used about the stew, plain and unperformed, meaning exactly itself. By the time the deep cold of December set its full weight on the mountain, the homestead had become something that Clara would not have known how to name a month prior. Not family. That word was too large, too loaded, and she was not incautious with large words. Not simply employment. That had stopped being accurate some weeks ago. Something in between. Something that was still assembling itself, like a house being built in stages, each new wall making the structure more real. Millie had taken to following Cade to the barn in the mornings with the casual possessiveness of a child who has decided someone belongs to her. He let her name the chickens, which she did with great ceremony and complete disregard for gender. One rooster she named Margaret, which she defended on the grounds that he had a Margaret personality. Cade received this information with complete seriousness. Clara, watching from the barn door with her arms folded against the cold, felt something move in her chest that she was beginning to stop fighting. June had started learning to read tracking signs, which Cade had begun teaching her after a discussion in which she argued, methodically and without pausing for breath, that knowing how to read an animal's passage was a survival skill, and she intended to survive. He'd given her a corner of the back wall of the barn where she could practice casting and reading impressions in the dirt, and he corrected her when she was wrong and told her when she was right with equal plainness, which was exactly what June needed. Not praise, but accuracy. And Clara had started to dream differently. Not about Thomas. She had dreamed about Thomas for 2 years, and some of those dreams were good, and some of them were the other kind, the ones that delivered grief fresh in the night, as if it had just happened. But now sometimes she dreamed about this place. The mountain in morning light, the kitchen with the stove going, the sound of the girls' voices from the other room. Sometimes there was someone else in these dreams, a presence in the periphery, dark-eyed and steady, that she was not yet ready to look at directly even in sleep. She woke from one of these on a cold December morning and lay still in the dark and listened to the mountain and thought about what she was allowing herself to feel and thought about what it meant to allow it and thought about all the ways a person could be wrong about another person and all the ways she had already been wrong about this man and found herself corrected. She thought about the word pity and what he'd said about it and the look on his face when he'd said it. She thought about what it would mean to believe it. She got up and lit the lamp and went to the kitchen and started the stove. And when he came in from the barn at 5:45 in the dark and cold, she had coffee ready and she looked at him in the lamplight and thought, I believe it. I am starting to fully believe it. She did not say this. The morning was not ready for it, and neither were they. But she kept it like a coal, small and hot and real, in the place where for 2 years there had been only the cold. The coal she kept, small and hot and real, did not stay small. That was the thing about fire on a mountain in winter. You could bank it low, you could cover it with ash, you could tell yourself it was only for warmth and nothing more. But fire has its own logic, and given enough time and the right conditions, it finds the air it needs and grows toward it. December moved through the homestead with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. The deep cold locked the world into a particular stillness. Sounds carried differently in it. Voices and footsteps and the knock of an axe, all of it crisp and close in the frozen air, as if the cold had stripped away the distance between things. Clara noticed she had stopped thinking of the mountain as something looming above her and started thinking of it as something she lived inside of, the way you live inside a house, aware of the walls, but not afraid of them. She and Cade had built a language together in the weeks since the passes closed. Not the language of people who talked constantly. Neither of them were that. But the language of people who had learned each other's rhythms. She knew he drank his second cup of coffee standing at the window, looking at the peaks, and that this was not melancholy but something closer to orientation, a man checking in with the landscape that organized his thinking. He knew she went quiet in the late afternoon when the light changed, and that this was not sadness but a kind of internal accounting, the hour when she reviewed the day and decided what she had made of it. They knew these things without discussing them. That kind of knowing accumulates like snowfall, each flake unremarkable, the accumulation significant. What neither of them discussed was the thing that had been present in the room since the night of the cut arm, since she'd said his name without planning to, since he'd told her he didn't do it out of pity and watched her face while he said it. It was there at the table when they sat across from each other in the evenings. It was there in the barn when she brought lunch out on cold days and they stood side by side watching the horses eat. It was there in the particular quality of the silences between them, which had become gradually and without announcement the kind of silence that holds something rather than the kind that fills nothing. June, who noticed everything and said most of it, had gone unusually quiet on the subject. Clara took this as evidence that June had made her assessment and was waiting for the adults to catch up. Millie had no such discretion. "Mister, Cade looked at you again at dinner," Millie said one night when Clara was braiding her hair before bed. "People look at people at dinner," Clara said. "That's what dinner is." "Not like that," Millie said, with the authority of a 6-year-old who has decided she understands something. "He looks at you like you're something important." Clara pulled the braid gently. "Go to sleep. I'm just saying what I see. I know what you're doing. Brush your teeth. Already, again, Clara said, thoroughly. She sat on the edge of the bed after the lamp was out, and Millie was quiet and held her own hands in her lap in the dark and thought about what it meant to be looked at like you were something important, and what it meant that she had started looking back. The storm came on the third week of December without the usual warning signs, which Cade said afterward was unusual. He had read this mountain's weather for 3 winters, and it had never come in from the northwest that fast, that hard. One morning, the sky was gray and ordinary, and by mid-afternoon, the wind was coming in with a sound that was less like weather and more like the mountain deciding something. Clara had the girls in the house and the cook stove banked high when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of an hour. The windows went white with it. The sound against the logs was continuous and pressing, not the variable gusting of ordinary storms, but a sustained, leaning weight, as if something enormous had put its shoulder to the house. Kate had been in the barn when it hit. Clara stood at the window and could not see the barn. She could not see 8 feet past the glass. She put on her coat. "Stay in the house," she told June in the voice that left no room for negotiation. "You do not open that door. You keep Millie by the fire. Do you understand me?" June looked at the white window and looked at her mother and said, with the particular gravity she used for important things, "Yes." Clara tied on her scarf and went out. The wind hit her like a wall. It was not the clean cold of regular winter, but the violent, disorienting cold of a blizzard, the kind that takes your sense of direction inside 15 steps. She kept her hand on the guide rope she'd noticed Cade had strung between the house and the barn 3 days after they'd arrived. She hadn't asked about it then, had simply noted it as another example of a man who thought about contingencies before they became emergencies. She found the barn by feel and hauled the door open against the wind and got it shut behind her and stood in the sudden relative quiet of the barn's interior, breathing hard. Cade was at the far stall, blankets over both horses, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who has a protocol. He looked up when she came in. "I told you to stay in." "You didn't tell me anything," she said. "You were already out here." She crossed the barn and picked up the spare blanket from the hook she'd learned was kept there for cold emergencies. "What needs doing?" He looked at her for one moment, the look she had come to know, the one that was assessing not whether she was capable, but whether she was all right. Then he said, "The water trough. It's got a cover, but the weight of the snow will collapse it if it builds up. I need someone on the north side to clear it while I secure the chicken coop." "Show me." He showed her. They worked in the barn's contained cold for 40 minutes, side by side and separately as needed, moving with the unspoken coordination of people who had been working in the same space long enough to know each other's range. Claire's hands went past cold into the particular numb that required attention, and she kept them moving because stopping was worse. When it was done, they stood inside the barn door and listened to the storm make its noise against the walls, and Clara's breath came in visible clouds and her whole body was shaking slightly with the cold. Cade reached over and took her hands in both of his. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the entirely practical gesture of a man checking for cold damage in someone's hands, rubbing warmth back into them with the direct, unsentimental thoroughness of a person who has treated frostbite and knows what it leads to if ignored. But his hands were large and warm, and hers were inside them, and neither of them moved for a moment after the practical reason had been satisfied. "You're all right," he said. His voice was level. "I know," she said. Hers was too, but neither of them moved. The storm pressed against the barn walls and the horses shifted in their stalls, and outside the world was white and featureless. And the only real things were the barn's warmth and his hands around hers and the particular suspended quality of the moment, like a breath held between one thing and whatever came after it. He released her hands. "We should get back to the house," he said. "Yes," she said. They went back through the rope-guided dark and the cold. Clara did not examine what had happened in the barn until much later that night, when the storm had eased to something the house could ignore and the girls were asleep and the fire had burned down to a steady, quiet red. She sat with it the way she sat with most things that mattered, not trying to force meaning onto it, just holding it gently and seeing what it showed her. What it showed her was that she was not afraid of him. She had been waiting, she realized, to find the thing that would make her afraid. The flash of contempt, the casual cruelty. The moment when the real map of a person revealed a country she didn't want to live in. She had been waiting because she had learned, through years of evidence, that the world was not particularly in the habit of offering things to women like her without attaching conditions to the offering. There were no conditions here that she hadn't agreed to. There was work and compensation and honesty, and a man who had rubbed warmth back into her hands with the same careful attention he gave to everything he did on this mountain. She banked the fire and went to bed and held the feeling carefully in the dark. Christmas came to the homestead in the form of a pine bough that Millie found on the porch one morning, propped against the door with a length of red ribbon tied around it. The ribbon clearly salvaged from somewhere in the house because it was the same red as the sewing ribbon in Clara's kit on the kitchen shelf. Millie brought it inside with the seriousness of someone receiving a significant gift. "He put it there," she told Clara, as if Clara might have supposed the pine bough had arrived independently. Clara looked at it. The ribbon was tied in a bow that suggested a man who had thought about the bow more than he was accustomed to thinking about bows. She found Cade in the barn, which was where he retreated when he'd done something that might require acknowledgement. "The pine bough," she said. He was brushing Pearl and did not look up. "I thought the girls might want something for the holiday." "They do," she said. "They love it." She stood at the stall door. "Thank you, Rowan." He looked up then. She was using his name naturally now, most of the time, and each time it landed in his expression like a small thing finding its place. "It's just a branch," he said. "It's not just a branch." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." They spent Christmas Day in the way the homestead spent all its days. Work in the morning, the particular work of winter maintenance and care, and then in the afternoon a stillness that was different from other days. Clara made a proper dinner with the preserved goods she'd been planning for weeks. A roasted bird from the chicken coop that had stopped laying, sweet potatoes from the root cellar, a dried apple pie that came out of the oven exactly right. June and Millie set the table with the particular care of children who understand that some meals are ceremonial. Cade came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. "Sit down," Clara said. "While it's hot." He sat. Millie climbed into her chair and positioned the stuffed bear in the remaining space on her left, which she had been doing since the first week and which nobody had ever suggested she stop doing. June sat across from Millie with her hands folded in the manner she adopted when she was trying to seem older than 9. They ate in the way they had learned to eat together, conversation moving through the meal in the easy, unstructured way of people who have grown comfortable with each other's presence. Cade said, at some point in the middle of it, "My mother made sweet potato like this, with the brown sugar." Everyone at the table understood that this was significant. He did not offer personal history easily, and what he offered was always deliberate. "Was she a good cook?" June asked. "Excellent," he said. "Better than this, to be honest." "That's not—" Clara started. "She had 20 more years of practice," he said, looking at her. "That's a fact, not a criticism." "There's a distinction?" Clara said. "There's always a distinction," he said, and something in his expression was warm in a way she was still not entirely accustomed to. After dinner, Millie fell asleep in her chair in the way of small children who have eaten well and been warm, and Cade lifted her with the matter-of-fact gentleness he had learned to use around her and carried her to the north room. Clara followed with the lamp, and they settled Millie together, him placing her down, Clara pulling the quilt, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the room, their daughter between them, and Clara thought, their daughter, and the word there surprised her enough that she caught her breath. She stepped back. He stepped back. They went out of the room without speaking. In the front room, June was still at the table with a book. She had discovered Cade's library in the first week and had been systematically working through it with the appetite of a child who had been given limited access to books for too long. She looked up when they came back. "Millie asleep?" she said. "Asleep," Clara confirmed. June looked at them both with the measured expression she used when she was thinking something she had decided not to say, then looked back at her book. Clara washed the dishes. Cade dried them. This was not a thing they had arranged. It had simply become the pattern, the way most of the household patterns had assembled themselves, not through negotiation, but through two people moving through the same space and finding where they fit. "She's something," Cade said quietly, when June had gone to bed, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen's lamp warmth. "June," Clara said. "Both of them," he said, "but June in particular. She's going to be extraordinary." Clara set the last dish on the shelf. "I know," she said. The pride and the grief came together, as they always did when she thought about what her daughters would become. Pride in who they were. Grief that Thomas wasn't here to see it. Thomas would have... She stopped. "Tell me about him," Cade said. She looked at him. "If you want," he said. She pulled her shawl tighter and sat down at the table, and he sat across from her, and she told him about Thomas Bennett. Not the loss of him, but the fact of him, the actual man, because she had realized recently that she had been so deep in the grief of his absence that she had almost lost the clear picture of his presence. Thomas, who laughed easily and trusted too much and had a gift for finding the best in situations that had no best in them. Thomas, who had walked west toward something he believed in, even knowing the risks, and had died before he reached it. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Cade said when she'd finished. "He was," she said. "He was worth knowing." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't talk about him much. People in Harrow Creek, they used his debt as a way to talk about him. As if the debt was who he was. Debt isn't who someone is." "I know that," she said. "But it's hard to hold on to when everyone around you is using it like a weapon." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something carefully. Then he said, "Nobody up here is using it." She looked at him. "No," she said. "Nobody up here is." Then. January arrived, and the mountain made its nature fully known. This was no longer the beautiful winter of December, the clean snow and the pink peaks, and Millie standing in the yard with her arms open. This was the interior of winter, the months that separated the people who had chosen the high country from the people who had been mistaken about it. Cold that had weight and intention, storms that could run 3 days, mornings when the temperature was below anything that felt like a number a body should survive, and yet the work still had to be done. Clara worked. She had always worked, but she worked differently now. Not with the hollow, grinding endurance of a woman who has nothing to work toward, but with the specific, directed energy of someone building something. She did not yet have the name for what she was building, but she felt it in the mornings when she lit the stove and heard the barn door close and knew he was coming in. She felt it in the evenings when June read aloud from whatever she'd found in Cade's library, and Millie contributed commentary, and Cade sat in the chair by the fire with his coffee and said things, occasionally, that made June put down the book and argue back with visible delight. One evening, Cade came in from the afternoon's work with snow on his shoulders and blood on his sleeve. A different cut than the first, a glancing blow from a piece of split wood that had caught him wrong. He came in looking sheepish in the particular way he'd adopted since she'd made him promise to say something when he was hurt, and held up his arm before she could speak. "I'm saying something," he said. Clara put down what she was doing. "Sit down." "It's not... Rowan, sit down." He sat. She cleaned the cut, smaller this time, less urgent, and wrapped it with the efficient hands of someone who was no longer practicing but simply doing what she knew how to do. He watched her work the way he always watched her, steadily, with that particular attention that was neither intrusive nor performative but simply present. "You're good at this," he said. "Lots of practice," she said. Thomas was also constitutionally incapable of coming inside when he was supposed to. "Maybe it's a type," he said. "Mountain men who don't know when to quit," she said, not looking up. "Men who know exactly when to quit but don't like admitting it," he said. She tied off the wrap and looked up, and found him looking at her with something in his expression that was fully open, more open than she had yet seen from him, more open than she'd seen from anyone in a very long time. Not performing anything, not constructing anything, just him, in the lamplight, with his arm in her hands. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He went still. "Not because I don't..." She stopped. She put down the cloth and pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her, steadying herself. "Not because I don't want to hear it," she said. "I need you to understand something first." He waited. She had not planned this conversation. She had not known until this moment that it was the conversation that had been building since the trading post floor, since the pine bough, since his hands around hers in the barn. She opened her mouth, and what came out was the version of herself she had been keeping in the deepest, least lit room. Not the capable Clara, not the enduring Clara, not the one who got back up because her daughters needed her to get back up. "I have spent years," she said, "being told by the world, by the way people look at me, by the things they say when they think I'm not listening, and the things they say when they know I am, that I am too much. Too big, too needy, too much trouble, too many problems, not enough of the things that matter. Her voice was steady. She had decided to keep it steady. Thomas loved me, and I knew he loved me, but he also came from that world, and sometimes it got into him too. The way he'd go quiet when people made comments, the way he'd change the subject instead of defending. She paused. I'm not saying that against him. I'm saying it to tell you what I came to this mountain carrying, what I'm still carrying. He had not moved. I'm saying, she continued, that if you're going to say something to me, I need to know it comes from what you actually see. Not from pity, which you've said, and I'm beginning to believe. Not from loneliness, which would be honest but not enough. From what you actually, clearly, truly see when you look at me. The fire moved in the hearth. Outside, the wind made its January sound. Her hands were still flat on the table, and his arm was still in front of her, wrapped in clean cloth, and he had not looked away from her face for the entire time she'd been speaking. You want me to tell you what I see, he said. Yes. He leaned forward slightly. His dark eyes held hers with a steadiness that did not waver. I see a woman who walked out of a life that was breaking her and walked into the unknown because she loved her children more than she feared the risk, he said. I see a woman who has learned every system in this house in 6 weeks and improved 3 of them without being asked. I see someone who cries in private so her daughters don't carry her pain on top of their own. A pause. I see someone who cleaned my arm the first time with the same careful hands she uses for everything. Not because it's expected, but because she cannot make herself do something halfway. Another pause. I see someone strong, genuinely, actually strong. Not despite how she is, but in it and through it and because of it. Clara was not crying. She had decided not to cry, and she was holding to that. I also see, he said more quietly, someone who is going to be loved exactly right or not at all, because she's been patient long enough and she deserves the right thing. The word loved landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Not loudly, but with consequence, the ripples moving outward through everything. She did not speak for a moment. That's what you see, she said. That's what I see, he said. She took a breath, let it out slowly. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat in the kitchen with the fire going down and the mountain making its winter sounds outside, and something that had been held carefully between them for 3 months was no longer being held. It was simply there, acknowledged and real, neither of them moving too fast, both of them understanding that some things need to be said before they can be built upon. And what had just been said was the foundation. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather had broken into one of January's rare clear spells and the light came off the snow in long, gold angles, Cade asked Clara to take a walk with him, not to check on anything, not to do a task, just to walk. She put on her coat and scarf, and they went out along the fence line to the south, where the property edged toward a stand of old pines, and the snow was undisturbed, and the silence had the quality of something sacred without being named. Their breath came in matched clouds. The footprints they made were the only marks on the field. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. I want to ask you to stay, he said. Not as an arrangement, not as an employee. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and his expression had the complete seriousness of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. As a partner, as the person who builds this with me. He paused. I'm asking June and Millie too. I'm asking all 3 of you. The mountains were behind him, enormous and white and indifferent in their beauty. The pines were dark against the sky. The whole landscape was so large and so still that a person could feel very small in it, and Clara had felt small in it many times. But not today. Today, standing in the snow with Rowan Cade's dark eyes on her face, she felt exactly the right size. What about the girls? She said. Not a refusal, a process. She needed to think aloud. I need to know what that means for them, what you're offering them. Everything I can, he said. A home and a name if they want it, and a man who will not let the world make them small. He paused. I know I can't replace Thomas. I'm not trying to. I know you're not, she said. I'm asking,
he said. Because I want this. Because I have wanted this since the morning I came into Pruitt's store and saw you putting yourself back together after he knocked you down. And I thought, that woman has no idea how strong she is. He paused. I want to be around when she finds out.
Clara stood in the cold and looked at him. She thought about the trading post floor. She thought about gray water in a bucket. She thought about Millie standing in the snow with her arms open, saying, "Oh," in the voice of a child receiving something wonderful. She thought about June naming the mare Pearl and being heard. She thought about the pine bough with the ribbon tied in a bow by a man who didn't usually think about bows. She thought about what it felt like to be looked at like you were something important. I need to ask the girls, she said. Of course, he said. Tonight, she said. I'll ask them tonight. They walked back to the house in the long January light, their footprints crossing back over their own tracks in the snow, and Clara held the question inside her chest. Not with anxiety, but with the particular careful reverence you hold something you already know the answer to and are simply not yet ready to say out loud. That evening, after dinner, after Cade had gone to check on the barn and given them the space without being asked, Clara sat with June and Millie at the table and told them what Rowan Cade had asked. Millie listened with the stuffed bear in her lap and her eyes very round. When Clara finished, Millie looked down at the bear and appeared to consult it internally, then looked up. I already think of this as home, she said. Clara's throat tightened. I know, baby. So yes, Millie said simply. Yes. June had been quiet through all of it, which was the most significant indicator of how seriously she was taking it. She was looking at the table, her hands folded, and Clara waited because June was always worth waiting for. He's not going to be our father, June said. It was not a question and not an objection. It was a statement being placed carefully like a stone on a scale. No, Clara said. Your father was your father. That doesn't change. But he would be... June stopped, trying on the shape of the idea. He would be someone who stays. He would be someone who stays, Clara confirmed. June raised her eyes. They were Thomas's eyes, dark and careful and capable of holding a great deal. He talks to me like I'm a person, she said. He doesn't talk down to me. No, Clara said. He doesn't. He's teaching me tracking, June said. He said in spring he'd show me how to read water signs for finding game. He didn't say maybe, and he didn't say we'll see. He said he would. I know. June was quiet for another moment. Then she looked at her mother and said with the full gravity of a 9-year-old who has made a considered decision, Then tell him yes. Clara reached across the table and took June's hand, and June led her, and Millie leaned in from the other side, and the three of them sat together at the table in the lamplight, with the mountain outside and the fire behind them. And Clara thought, we are not what Harrow Creek said we were. We were never what Harrow Creek said we were. When Cade came in from the barn 20 minutes later and hung his coat and turned, she was standing in the kitchen looking at him. Yes, she said. He stood in the doorway with the cold still on him and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. Exactly. He was not the kind of man who showed surprise easily, but something that went deeper than surprise, something that moved through his face like water through stone, quiet and permanent. Yes, he said back. And Millie from the front room said loudly, We all said yes, Mr. Cade, even the bear. Clara laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind she'd forgotten she was capable of. And it went up into the rafters of that mountain house and stayed there like something that belonged. The laugh stayed in the rafters, and the winter held them, and January became February in the way that months become other months on a mountain. Not gently, not with ceremony, but with a gradual shift in the quality of the light that you only notice after the fact. They did not rush anything. This was something Clara appreciated about Rowan Cade more than she had words for. His understanding that good things required their own time, that forcing the pace of something real was how you made it false. The yes had been said, and it lived in the house with them, present and unhurried, like a plant that had been given good soil and sufficient light and was being allowed to become what it was going to become. There were changes, subtle and significant. He began saying us in the natural run of conversation. We'll need to check the south fence before the thaw. And the word arrived each time without weight or performance, simply the accurate pronoun for what they had become. She began leaving his coffee on the window ledge where he stood in the mornings, knowing where he'd be before he was there, and he began checking the north room when he came in from a long afternoon, not entering it, just stopping at the door and listening to make sure the girls were all right. A gesture so quiet that Clara only noticed because she had started noticing everything about him. June had taken to asking him questions in the evenings that were no longer purely practical, no longer just, how do you read a fox track and what does green wood smell like when it burns, but things that circled closer to who he was. She asked about Kansas and what had gone wrong there. He told her some of it, a ranch partnership that had collapsed, a winter that had taken too much. And June listened with her chin in her hands and her dark eyes steady, and when he finished, she said, "So you came here and started over." "More or less," he said. "Mama did that too," June said. "She's good at it." Cade looked at Clara across the table. "I know," he said. Clara looked back at him and thought, yes, you do. And the fact that he did, the fact that he had seen it before she'd been able to see it herself, was still something she was learning to hold without flinching. Marsan. February brought the first softening. Not spring, nothing as definitive as spring, but a hint of it in certain afternoons when the wind came from the south and the snow at the base of the fence post developed that slightly glassy crust that meant somewhere, far away, a thaw was being considered. Clara noticed it and felt something corresponding in herself, a loosening at the edges of the vigilance she had kept for so long. She had begun writing again. Not letters. There was nobody in Harrow Creek she wanted to write to, and no way to send them until the passes opened. But pages in the composition book she'd bought with her first month's wages from Pruitt and never used, because writing required a still mind, and she hadn't had one in 2 years. She wrote at the kitchen table in the evenings after the girls were in bed and Cade was in whatever part of the house he occupied in the quiet hours. She wrote about Thomas and about the mountain and about June and Millie. And sometimes she wrote about what it felt like to be inside a life that was finally, provisionally, fragile as new ice but real, a life that felt like it was for her rather than despite her. She did not show him the pages, but he saw the composition book on the table and said nothing about it, which was exactly right. One evening, he came in from the barn and stopped at the kitchen door and said, "Come outside." She looked up from the table. "It's February." "Put your coat on." She put her coat on. He led her around the south side of the house to a place where the snow had been packed down by their regular passage and pointed up. The sky was clear and the stars were, she had known there were stars, she had always known there were stars, but she had not looked at them from up here before. From this altitude, from this particular dark that had no town lights in any direction, and the density of them was shocking, the kind of thing that makes the mind go briefly quiet in the face of scale. "I forgot," she said. "What?" "That they looked like that." She stood with her head tipped back. "In Harrow Creek you could see them, but not like this." "Different air," he said. He was standing beside her, both of them looking up. No coal smoke, no lamp glow, just the mountain. She stood in the cold and looked at the stars and felt the particular freedom of a person who has been given, without warning, something beautiful they had stopped expecting. "Thomas used to say the stars were the same everywhere," she said. "That if you were ever lost, you could look up and find yourself." "That's true enough," Cade said. He also said the star with the red edge was a planet, but he was never certain which one. She paused. He was the kind of man who said things confidently and then admitted afterward when he was guessing. Cade was quiet for a moment. "I like that," he said. "That's an honest way to be." She lowered her head and found him looking at her, not at the stars, at her. She met his gaze in the cold and the dark. "You would have liked him," she said. "You two would have. I think you would have understood each other." Something moved in his face. Not grief, he'd never known Thomas, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a loss he hadn't suffered personally, but could see the shape of. "I believe you," he said. They stood in the cold for another minute, both looking up. Then she took his arm, just the crook of it, the way you take an arm when you are standing beside someone in the dark and the cold, and the sky is very large, and you want one thing to hold on to that is solid and warm and real. He covered her hand with his. They stayed like that until the cold made it impractical, and then went inside. The passes began to open in the last week of March. It happened in stages. First the southernmost trail, then the main road, then the Harrow Creek Pass on a Thursday morning when the temperature climbed enough to make travel possible, cautious and real. Cade told her at breakfast. He said it plainly, without preamble, the way he said things that had significance. Roads open to town. Clara poured coffee and sat down across from him and said, I know. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it, she said. I need to go down. June, at the other end of the table, looked up from her breakfast. Millie was watching Clara with the careful attention she applied to situations she sensed were important. I have business, Clara said. With Pruitt and some other things. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I want to go myself. With you, but I want to handle it myself. Cade nodded slowly. All right. You're not going to ask what business? I expect you'll tell me what you want me to know, he said. She looked at him across the table. The debt, she said. He kept records, his version of them. I have my own. I want to go in with my records and get a written statement from him that the debt was settled. She paused. He'll say the money you paid didn't cover it. He'll have found a reason. He always has a reason. Probably, Kate agreed. I want to handle it, she said again. Not you, I need to be the one who stands there. I understand, he said. Do you? Yes, he said. You've been waiting to do it since you walked out. He said it without drama, as a simple fact of her character that he had understood for some time. I'll be there if you need me, not before. She held his gaze. That's exactly what I need, she said. They came down the mountain on a clear April morning, the world below still mud-soft with the melt, the grasses just beginning to attempt green at the south-facing slopes, the sky that particular clean blue that appears between winter and spring, as if to remind the world what blue actually looks like. Clara wore her good coat, not the work coat she'd lived in all winter, but the dark wool one she'd brought from the boarding house, brushed clean and pressed with the iron she'd borrowed from the homestead's kitchen. Her hair was pinned, her back was straight. She had not particularly planned the composition of herself, but she was aware of it. Aware that she was arranging herself the way you arrange something that matters before it goes somewhere important. June and Millie rode in the wagon bed. Millie had brought the bear tucked inside her coat, bare ears visible at the collar. June sat upright with her hands in her lap and her Thomas eyes forward, watching the descent with the expression she used for things she knew were significant. Harrow Creek appeared in the valley below them as they came around the last long curve. The familiar collection of buildings, the steeple, the trading post sign just visible from the road. Clara looked at it and felt the thing she'd been expecting to feel. A tightening, a muscle memory of diminishment, the particular reflex of someone who has been made small in a specific place. She felt it, noted it, and set it aside. You all right? Cade said. Yes, she said. You look all right, he said, with the specific emphasis that meant he was saying two things at once. She glanced at him. I feel it too, she said. The town, the feeling of it. That's normal. I know. She looked back at the road. It's not in charge anymore. He said nothing. The wagon moved down the last of the slope. The first person who saw them was Holt Greer, coming out of the smithy as the wagon turned onto the main street. He stopped with his hand on the smithy door and watched them pass, and Clara watched him watching her, and she did not look away. He was the first one who looked down. She noted this. She kept walking. Cade pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, but not Pruitt's, which was farther down, but Alderman's, which carried what she needed in terms of spring supplies. He jumped down and came around and offered his hand, which she took, and she stepped down to the street and stood in Harrow Creek, Montana, for the first time since the October afternoon when she had walked out of Pruitt's trading post behind a man she hadn't yet decided to trust. Several people on the street had stopped. She recognized most of them. Mrs. Calloway from the dry goods, the Deaver brothers from the North Ranch, a woman she knew only as Porter's wife who had once, at a church social 2 years past, suggested to the woman beside her in Clara's clear hearing that the Bennett widow was letting herself go, as if grief had a dress code she was failing to meet. Clara looked at all of them with the same even, steady attention. Not defiant. She was not performing defiance, just present.
Just here, in the same street she'd walked with her eyes down for 2 years, walking it now with her eyes level. Mrs. Calloway nodded at her. It was a different kind of nod than the ones Clara remembered. She nodded back. "I'll get the dry goods," Cade said quietly. "You go ahead." She went ahead. What? Pruitt's trading post looked smaller than she remembered. This surprised her because she had expected it to loom, to have the same oppressive scale it had carried in her memory through a winter of mountain air and open sky. But it was a medium-sized building on a medium-sized street, and the sign above the door needed paint, and the window to the left of the entrance had a crack in it that hadn't been there in October and nobody had gotten around to fixing. She pushed open the door. The bell above it rang, the same bell that had rung above her head on every arrival and departure for the 2 years she'd worked here. It sounded different from the outside, lighter, somehow. Emmett Pruitt was behind the counter, talking to a man Clara didn't know. He looked up when the bell rang, the automatic look of a shopkeeper, and then recognition arrived in his face, and his expression did the thing she'd been watching his expressions do for 2 years. It assembled itself into the configuration he used for her, the one that combined dismissal with the particular pleasure of a man who has power and enjoys exercising it. "Clara Bennett," he said. "Pruitt," she said. She walked to the counter. The man he'd been talking to was watching with the interest people always showed when they sensed a scene developing. Clara kept her attention on Pruitt. "Didn't expect to see you down off the mountain," Pruitt said. The tone was the familiar one, the one that put mountain in a category he could condescend to, that put her in a category slightly below that. "I imagine not," she said. "I need the ledger pages for the Bennett account. My record and yours." Something shifted in his face. "What for?" "To reconcile them," she said. "I have documentation of every day I worked and what was agreed for each day. I want a written accounting of what was settled in October and what, if anything, remains." "That account's closed," Pruitt said. "Then it should be simple to document," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The store was very quiet. Somewhere in the back she could hear the sound of someone moving stock, the scrape of crates on a wood floor. "Cade paid off your balance," Pruitt said. "That was the arrangement." "That was your figure," Clara said. "Your unverified figure, given verbally. I'm asking for written documentation that the debt is settled in full, in your hand, signed." His eyes narrowed. "You've gotten something up there on that mountain," he said. The tone had shifted, still trying for the old dominance, but something had lost its footing in it, like a man walking on ice who isn't certain of his balance. Some kind of notion about yourself. "I've always had notions about myself," Clara said. "You mistook my silence for an absence of them." A pause. The man Pruitt had been talking to had gone completely still. Pruitt's jaw moved. She watched him reach for the old weapons, the public humiliation, the record of her failings, the implication that she owed him something beyond what she'd already paid, and she watched him find them blunted. She was not the woman on her knees with a rag in her hands and a bucket of gray water at her side. She was standing up, and she was looking at him, and she was not going to look away. "You don't have grounds to come in here making demands," he said. The dominance was thinner now, more effort in it. "Cade's money, Cade's business. You were a debt that got paid. That doesn't give you—" "I was a person with an account," Clara said. "I worked 2 years against that account at terms you set and changed at your convenience. I want a written statement. That is a reasonable request from someone who is owed a reasonable record." She laid her own ledger pages on the counter, the pages she had kept herself in the composition book in her own careful hand, every date and every amount and every day of labor, all of it. "These are mine. I have the original notes from when the arrangement was made in your handwriting. I would like yours to match." He stared at the pages. There was a long moment. Then the back of the store door opened and a young man came through with a crate, stopped at the sight of the scene at the counter, and retreated hastily. Pruitt looked up from the pages to her face, and she held his gaze, and she thought about the gray water bucket and the cold floor and the way he had said making a scene as if the scene were her fault rather than his instrument. She thought about all the afternoon she had swallowed the things that deserved to be said. She did not swallow them now, but she also did not raise her voice. She did not require drama. The steadiness itself was enough. "Write it out," she said. "Please."
He wrote it out. She watched him do it. His handwriting was thick and deliberate. A man unused to being in a position where he was the one producing the document rather than reading it. When he finished, he pushed it across the counter and she read it. All of it, every word, and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. She turned and walked out of Pruitt's trading post. The bell rang above the door. She stepped onto the street into the April light and stood there for a moment with the document in her pocket and the air on her face, and let herself feel it, the full specific satisfaction of a thing completed. Cade was waiting near the wagon, the dry goods loaded. He was leaning against the side of it with his arms folded, watching her come toward him, and his expression was the open one, the fully open one she'd seen first in the kitchen after she'd told him what she needed him to understand. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He looked at her face, reading it the way he'd learned to read it over a winter of close proximity. "You all right?" "Better than all right," she said. "I'm excellent." Something in him came as close to a grin as she'd yet seen from him. Not the almost smile, not the warmth at the corners, but something fuller and more unguarded, lasting about 2 seconds before his habitual expression reassembled itself. "Excellent," he said, as if the word was interesting to try on. "It's a real word," she said. "I know it's a real word." "Use it more often," she said, and walked past him to say hello to Millie and June, and heard him behind her make a sound that she was almost certain was a laugh. They did the remaining errands with the ease of people who have nothing left to prove. Supplies from Alderman's, a stop at the post office where there was a letter from Clara's sister in Billings that she tucked into her pocket to read on the road home, a conversation with the Deaver brothers who spoke to Cade about the spring cattle situation, and to Clara with a careful, recalibrated respect that she accepted without comment. "Mrs." Calloway stopped her on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods. "Clara," she said. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with the watchful eyes of someone who collected information as a matter of habit. "You're looking well." "I am well," Clara said. Mrs. Calloway looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who has witnessed another woman's low point and is now recalibrating. "The mountain suits you," she said, and it sounded like the most honest thing she had said to Clara in the entire time Clara had lived in Harrow Creek. "It does," Clara said. "My daughters are thriving." "I hear—" Mrs. Calloway stopped, started again. "I hear Mr. Cade is a decent man." "He is," Clara said. "Well," Mrs. Calloway straightened slightly, the way people do when they realize they've gotten somewhere unexpected. "I'm glad for you, Clara. I should have—" She stopped again. Her face did something brief and honest. "I should have said something, before. When Pruitt—" "You could have," Clara said. Not cruelly, just honestly. "But I'm all right. We're all right." She left Mrs. Calloway on the boardwalk and did not look back, and it felt like the right kind of leaving. Okay. They married in June, on the homestead, on a morning when the mountain meadow had opened into the particular extravagance that Montana high country manages for about 6 weeks a year. Wildflowers through the grass, the peaks showing their full height above the tree line, the air carrying the smell of pine and snowmelt, and something sweeter that Clara had no name for. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher who came through the valley on his spring rounds, a compact, practical man named Aldred who had married and buried his way through enough of Montana's high country to understand that ceremonies here were brief and real rather than elaborate and performative. He had been told to keep it short, which he was visibly grateful for. There were 2 witnesses, Millie, who wore her best dress and held the bear in the crook of her arm with the dignity of a maid of honor, and June, who stood straight as a soldier and looked like Thomas enough to make Clara's throat close briefly. Cade wore a clean shirt and had shaved, and he stood in the meadow and looked at her coming across the grass. She had not been walked down any aisle. She had simply walked across the meadow from the house to where he was standing, because walking to him herself was the only version of this she wanted, and his expression was the open one, the fully open one, and it did not compose itself back into anything more guarded. He let her see it. All of it. Aldred said the words. They said theirs. When it was done, and Aldred was packing his saddlebag, and Millie was attempting to explain the bear's role in the proceedings to a nearby fence post, June came to stand beside Clara and took her hand without looking at her, the particular gesture of a child who is feeling something she doesn't want to show on her face. Clara squeezed her hand. "You okay?" she asked.
June was quiet for a moment. Papa would have liked him, she said finally. Clara looked at the mountain. I know, she said. I know he would have. June squeezed back and let go, and went to argue with Millie about something practical and ordinary. And Clara stood in the meadow in her good dress with the June sun on her face and thought about Thomas, who had believed in going west, and about what it meant that West had brought her here. Not to the thing he'd imagined, but to something that was real and solid and built from her own choosing, from the choices she had made with her own clear eyes open. She felt Cade come to stand beside her. What are you thinking about? He said. How far I came, she said. He looked at the peaks. In miles? In everything, she said. He took her hand. His hand was large and warm and familiar now. The specific familiar of a hand you've held through a winter and found reliable. The meadow was bright, and the mountain was enormous above them, and the wildflowers were doing their brief, extravagant best. Well, he said, you made it. We made it, she said. He turned his head and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. We made it, he said, and the correction was not a correction at all, but an agreement, the first of many, the practice of a shared life beginning its real and daily work. Down the meadow, Millie was laughing at something, the sound of it clear in the mountain air, bright and unguarded and whole. And June was laughing too, despite herself, and Aldred was on his horse now, making his way down the trail, and the mountain stood above all of it exactly as it had always stood, patient, large, indifferent to human time. And Clara Cade, who had once scrubbed floors for a man who told her she took up space without doing good, stood in the June meadow of her own life and felt herself, finally and completely, take up exactly the right amount of space. The summer after the wedding was the kind of summer that gets remembered, not because anything singular happened. No single day stood apart from the others as the day everything changed. It was more that everything had already changed, and the summer was the first season Clara lived inside that change, without bracing for it to be taken away. She woke each morning in the north room that was no longer the north room, but simply their room, and the sounds of the homestead coming alive around her. Millie's feet on the floorboards, the barn door, the particular creak of the front porch when Cade stepped out in the early dark to read the weather. All of it had the quality of things that belong, not borrowed, not provisional. Hers. She had not known how much of her energy had been spent waiting for things to be taken until she stopped spending it. The homestead itself seemed to know something had shifted. That summer, Cade and Clara extended the south fence line to take in a lower meadow they'd been talking about since February, a conversation that had begun as practical and become somewhere in the middle of a Tuesday in March, a conversation about the future, about what the land could carry, what they wanted to build, what kind of place this would be in 10 years. The fence extension took 3 weeks and required both of them working at full capacity, and June, who at 9.5 had developed a usefulness she wore like a badge, carrying posts and holding lines and occasionally offering structural opinions that were, Cade said once with great seriousness, better than some he'd gotten from men twice her age. June had accepted this as her due and gone back to work. Millie, that summer, decided she wanted chickens of her own. Not the existing chickens, which were communal property and named but not individually managed, but chickens that were specifically her responsibility. She presented this proposal to Cade at dinner one evening with the particular combination of Millie logic and Millie feeling that made her arguments difficult to dismiss. She would feed them, she would collect eggs, she would keep records in a notebook like Mama's, she would name them, and she would personally ensure that nothing ate them. What if a fox gets in? Cade said. I'll handle it, Millie said. How? I'll think of something, she said, with complete confidence. Cade looked at Clara. Clara looked at her coffee cup. He looked back at Millie. 6 chickens, he said. Your direct responsibility. Millie's face underwent a transformation that Clara filed away in the growing collection of moments she wanted to keep forever. Pure, undefended joy, the face of a child being taken seriously about something that mattered to her. She slid off her chair and hugged Cade around the middle, which was a thing she had begun doing sometime in January without either of them marking the specific moment it became natural. And he put his hand briefly on the top of her head in the way he'd developed. Matter of fact, unhurried, the gesture of a man learning how to be someone's person without having had a template for it. Clara watched this and thought about the boarding house room and the single wool blanket and the cold, and thought, we are so far from that. We are a world away from that. She was. The
The summer brought visitors. Not many. The homestead's location did not encourage casual dropping by. But some. The circuit preacher Aldred came through in July on his seasonal rounds and stayed 2 nights, eating enormously and talking with Cade about local politics and range disputes in the way of men who had both been watching the territory long enough to have opinions. Clara fed him and listened and contributed when she had something to say, which was more often than it would have been a year ago. More significant was the arrival, in August, of a woman named Ruth Deaver, no relation to the Ruth who had been Cade's dog, though Millie found the coincidence meaningful, who was the wife of the younger Deaver brother from the North Ranch, and who arrived at the homestead one afternoon on a horse she'd ridden hard with a cut on her cheek that she was already prepared to explain away. Clara saw the cut and saw the explanation forming and said, "Come inside." Cade, who had been in the yard when Ruth Deaver arrived, found something to do in the barn. Clara sat Ruth Deaver at the kitchen table and cleaned the cut and did not ask questions in the order that would back her into a corner, which was the order most people asked them. She asked about the Deaver Ranch. She asked about the spring calving. She asked about Ruth's sister in Billings, whom she'd heard about through Alderman's store gossip. And while she talked and listened, she watched Ruth Deaver's shoulders come down from around her ears, watched the breath come back into her at a more natural depth, watched the woman find, in the kitchen of a homestead she'd never visited before, something that felt like ground. "I don't know what to do," Ruth said finally. It was said quietly, looking at the table, the way hard truths are said when a person has decided to stop holding them alone. "I know," Clara said. "I didn't either, for a long time." Ruth looked up. She was younger than Clara had realized, maybe 24, 25. The cut on her cheek was already purpling at the edges. "I had 2 children, and a debt, and a town that had decided what I was worth," Clara said. She said it plainly, not performing her own history but offering it as actual information. "I know what it feels like when you can't see a way that isn't worse than what you already have." "How did you—" Ruth stopped. "Someone paid attention," Clara said. "Someone saw what I was carrying and asked, without drama, if I wanted help. That's all it takes. Somebody paying attention and asking." She held Ruth Deaver's gaze. "I'm asking." What followed was a long conversation that moved through the afternoon and into the early evening. Practical, specific, not at all the abstract comfort that Clara had received from people who meant well but couldn't help. They talked about what Ruth had, what she didn't have, who in Harrow Creek she could trust, and who she could not, what options the territory's law provided, and where the law was useful and where it was not. Clara had learned things in the past year that she hadn't known she was learning. From Cade, from the territory itself, from the simple process of being a person who made decisions about her own life and had to understand what those decisions could rest on. When Ruth left near dusk, she left with 3 names written on a piece of paper and the address of Clara's sister in Billings, and the knowledge that she was not the only person who had stood in that particular dark and found her way to a door. Cade came in from the barn as the sound of Ruth's horse faded down the trail. "All right," he said. "She will be," Clara said. She was at the stove, moving through the motions of dinner with the automatic competence of someone whose hands know what they're doing while her mind is somewhere else. "It'll take time, but she will be." He came to the kitchen and stood near her without touching, the proximity that was its own language. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "Making people feel like they've got room," he said. "Like there's ground under them." She looked at him. "You did that for me first," she said. "I paid a debt," he said. "You showed me a door," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her with the open expression, the fully open one, that was still, after months, something she did not take for granted. "You walked through it yourself," he said. "I did," she said, "but knowing the door was there mattered." She turned back to the stove. He moved to the table, and in the space between them, easy and warm and real, the life they had built continued its daily work. The years moved the way years move when you are living inside them rather than enduring them, faster than expected, fuller than anticipated, marked not by single dramatic events but by the accumulation of days that matter. The first winter they were married, they survived a 3-week closure of every pass and trail that would have been catastrophic if they hadn't spent October preparing for exactly this possibility and had not, as Cade said, and as Clara had stopped being modest enough to argue with, an exceptional larder manager. They ran the homestead as a true partnership, which meant that the divisions of labor were determined by what needed doing and who was best positioned to do it, not by a prior arrangement about what belonged to whom. Clara ran cattle numbers in the winter months when they were snowbound and developed a system for tracking the herd that Cade said was better than the one he'd been using. He built a second room onto the house in the second summer, properly framed, properly floored, because the homestead was expanding not in ambition, but in the natural fact of being a place where more life kept arriving. Ruth Deaver left her husband in the spring of the second year. She came to the homestead twice before she did it. Once to talk through what she'd decided, and once, afterward, to say that she'd done it and that it had been terrible and that she was all right. Clara fed her both times and listened with the specific, undistracted attention of someone who understood from the inside what was being said. "You should have been a doctor," Ruth told her on the second visit. "I should have been a lot of things," Clara said. "I still am." Ruth laughed at this, a surprised, real laugh, and Clara thought, that's it. That's the sound of a person starting to breathe again. She knew that sound. She had made it herself, once, in a mountain house on the first night her daughters were warm. June turned 11 the summer after the wedding, and 12 the summer after that, and the person she was becoming was so clearly, specifically herself, that Clara sometimes had to stop and simply look at her. Thomas was in her eyes, and her arguments and her absolute refusal to accept a smaller account of things than she believed was true. But there was something else in her too, something she had gathered on the mountain. A sureness, a groundedness, a knowledge that the world could be hard, and that hard was not the same as impossible. She had become, by 12, a genuine tracker. Cade had kept his promise about the water signs, and then kept teaching beyond it, because June's appetite for learning was the kind that couldn't be filled with a course of instruction. It required constant replenishment. She could read a trail now in conditions that would defeat most men, and she did so with the particular intensity of someone who has found the thing they were made for and is in the process of learning its full dimensions. "She's going to be extraordinary," Cade said again one evening, watching June come back from the South Meadow with a notepad full of observations she'd made about the elk passage through the lower tree line. "I know," Clara said. "I know." "What does she want to do when she's older?" Clara thought about this. "She wants to know everything," she said. "I think the specific application is secondary. She wants to understand how the world works." "She'll find a way to make that mean something," he said. "She already does," Clara said. Millie, meanwhile, had become the homestead's particular kind of necessary. Not in the dramatic way, not in the way that made itself obvious, but in the way of water and warmth and the sounds that told you a place was alive. She was 9 and wholly herself, the bear long since relegated to a shelf above her bed, though she still touched it each night before sleep, a habit she didn't perform for anyone, and that Clara knew about only because she sometimes checked. She had her 6 chickens, all named, all known to her by individual character and preference, and she maintained a notebook of their daily activity that was, Clara had discovered by accident, written in a narrative style. Not records, but stories, small daily accounts of what Margaret the rooster had done and what it might have meant. "She's a writer," Cade said, when Clara showed him a page of it. "She's something," Clara said. "Like her mother," he said. Clara looked at him. "You've read my composition book." "No," he said. "I've seen your face when you write in it." She did not have an answer for that. She picked up her coffee cup instead, which was a thing she had noticed she did when he said something that reached her before she had a defense ready. He noticed this too. She knew he noticed because of the brief, warm quality that arrived in his expression in those moments. Not triumph, nothing like triumph, but something that was closer to gratitude. The feeling of a man who is continually given evidence that the person he chose is the person he thought she was. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Emmett Pruitt sold the Trading Post. Clara heard this from Mrs. Calloway, with whom she had developed something that was not exactly friendship, but was a genuine, useful connection. The connection of 2 women who had both, in different ways, operated for a long time under the assumption that their options were limited,
and had arrived, through different routes, at a revision of that assumption.
Mrs. Calloway told her in the street in front of Alderman's on one of the twice-monthly trips to town that had become the homestead's regular rhythm. Sold it to a family from Billings, Mrs. Calloway said. Husband and wife. Young. They're fixing the sign already. Clara thought about the sign, thought about the bell above the door, thought about gray water in a bucket.
Good, she said. He's gone to Denver, apparently, Mrs. Calloway said. Or that's what he told Alderman. Nobody's particularly... Well, she stopped. Looked at Clara with the honest eyes she'd been showing more of lately. Nobody's particularly sorry. Clara nodded. She turned this over in her mind on the ride back up the mountain. The fact of Pruitt's absence. What it did and didn't change. What she felt about it. What she found was this. It changed nothing that mattered. The document in her coat pocket from that April morning 3 years ago had changed something. Standing at his counter and looking at him without looking down had changed something. Pruitt himself going to Denver or anywhere else was simply weather. The real work had already been done, by her, in herself. She told Cade that evening. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I don't feel anything particular," she said. "Which is the right answer?" He turned this over. "Means you're done with it." "I was done with it before he left," she said. "I finished it when I walked out of his store with the written record in my pocket." She looked at the fire. "He had power over me because I let the debt define me. When I stopped letting it define me, he stopped having power. His physical location is beside the point." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't think you know how much you've changed," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not saying it as a compliment," he said. "I'm saying it as a fact. The woman I watched in that trading post she was strong. I saw the strength. That's why I acted. But it was strength under pressure, compressed, turned inward because there was nowhere safe to turn it." He paused. "What you are now isn't that. It's the same strength, but with room around it. Room to breathe. It goes outward now. Ruth Deaver knows what I mean. Other people who've sat in our kitchen know what I mean." Clara looked at the fire for a long moment. "You did that," she said finally. "You did that," he said. "I opened a door. You've been building the house ever since." She looked at him. The fire moved. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did. Enormous, patient, utterly indifferent to the particular conversation happening in one lighted house on its slope, and entirely indifferent to the significance of that conversation, which is what mountains are for. They make the human scale feel right-sized by contrast. They give a person something to be small against without being diminished by it. "Rowan," she said. "Clara," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Not for any single thing. For the accumulation." He held her gaze across the room with the dark, steady eyes she had been reading for 3 years, and still found sometimes something new in. "Same," he said. It was enough. It was, as always, exactly enough. Well, the autumn of the 3rd year brought the first snow early. Not the vicious early storm, but the preliminary kind, the first snow, the mountain's announcement that it was turning the page. Clara stood on the porch in the morning of it and watched it come down in the way she had made a practice of. Simply watching, not assessing, not calculating what it would mean for the woodpile or the south fence or the chickens. Just looking at the world receive itself. She was 34 years old. She had been a wife and a widow and a woman on her knees on a stranger's floor and a woman standing in her own meadow in a June dress saying words that meant, "I choose this." She had been someone that a town had decided to diminish and someone that a mountain had held with complete neutrality, offering neither pity nor cruelty, but simply its terms, which were hard and clean and fair in the way that nature is fair. It doesn't care who you were before, only what you're capable of now. She had turned out to be capable of quite a lot. Inside the house, she could hear Millie talking to the chickens through the back window, which Millie did every morning, regardless of weather, maintaining what she called their relationship. She could hear June, home from the Alderman schoolroom that she'd been attending 3 days a week since September at Clara and Cade's insistence most particularly, his reading of June's appetite for learning, having produced the conviction that anything less than this would be a failure of responsibility. June had argued briefly that she could learn as much at home and then stopped arguing because she had discovered that the schoolroom had books she hadn't read yet, and a teacher, Miss Eldon,
who was willing to argue back. She could hear Cade in the barn, the door, the particular sequence of sounds that meant the morning was proceeding normally, which was the thing she loved most about morning sounds now. Their normality, their blessedness of normality. She went inside and started the coffee. That winter, a woman arrived at the homestead on foot. She came up the trail in November, when the snow was already deep enough to make travel punishing, and she arrived at the door in the condition of someone who had traveled hard and without adequate preparation. Not dressed for the cold, not carrying enough. The particular driven quality of a person who left without fully thinking through the logistics, because staying was worse than any logistics. Her name was Vera, and she was from a ranch 2 valleys over, and she had 2 boys with her, 7 and 9, both of them wrapped in a coat that was too small for the purpose of wrapping 2 boys in it, both of them holding each other's hands with the grip of children who have decided this is necessary. Clara opened the door and said, "Come in, all 3 of you." She did not ask questions in the doorway. She got them inside and to the fire and made the 7-year-old, who was shaking badly, hold a warm cup with both hands, and she caught Cade's eye across the room, and he went without a word to deal with the practical exterior things, checking the trail for anyone following, seeing to the logistics of 3 extra people and what that would require. Millie, who had been at the kitchen table with her chicken notebook, looked at the 2 boys with the interested, assessing look she used for new things. Then she got up and went to the shelf above her bed and came back with the stuffed bear and set it on the table in front of the 7-year-old without saying anything. The 7-year-old looked at the bear. "His name is Bear," Millie said. "He's good when things are loud." The boy put his hand on the bear carefully, as if it might be taken away. "You can hold him," Millie said. "I don't need him for sleeping anymore." He picked up the bear and held it against his chest, with the 7-year-old version of the same grip Millie had used for 3 years, and Clara, standing at the stove with her back to the room, held very still for a moment and felt something pass through her that she couldn't have named, something that was grief and love and gratitude all moving at once, inextricable from each other, a single thing. Vera stayed for 6 days. In those 6 days, Clara did what she had done with Ruth Deaver, and before that with herself. She gave Vera the practical information, the names and the addresses, and the knowledge of what the law could and couldn't do, and where to find people who understood the difference. She gave her the specific, unsentimental accounting of what resources existed and how to access them. And she sat with her in the evenings after the children were in bed and let her talk, and listened with the full attention that Clara had once been desperate for, and had not received, and had therefore become determined to offer. On the 6th day, Vera left for Billings, where Clara's sister had agreed, through a letter written in fast November handwriting and carried down by Cade on a supply run, to receive her. The 2 boys went with their mother, the 7-year-old having been persuaded, through 3 days of relationship building by Millie, that the bear was traveling with them for the purpose of looking after them. "You gave him the bear," Clara said to Millie that evening, when Vera and the boys were gone and the house had returned to its own 4. "He needed it more," Millie said, with the completeness of that logic. "You've had that bear since you were 3. "I know." Millie looked at the shelf where the bear had sat. "But I'm 9 now, and I don't need it for sleeping anymore. I said that." She paused. "I'll miss it, but missing things is different from needing them." Clara looked at her daughter, 9 years old, round-faced, with the bear-shaped absence on the shelf behind her, and the complete unself-conscious dignity of someone who has made a decision they know is right. "When did you get so wise?" Clara said. Millie considered. "I think I always was," she said. "I just had to get big enough to say it." The homestead grew. Not dramatically, not in a single season, but in the gradual, committed way of things built to last. Cade and Clara added 2 more cattle seasons, and a horse breeding operation that began with Pearl, the mare June had named, and that had turned out, in Cade's assessment, to have exceptional bloodlines, and expanded in the 3rd year to 4 mares and a stud acquired from a ranch in the Yellowstone Valley. Clara managed the books for all of it, developing over time a system that she knew, with the practical confidence of someone who has learned a skill from the ground up, was sound and clear and better than most. She also kept writing. The composition book had been the first. There were others after it, and after those others more still. She wrote at the kitchen table in the mornings before the house woke up, or in the evenings by the fire, or occasionally on the porch in the brief Montana spring, when the air was new and the light had that quality of being freshly washed. She wrote about the homestead and the mountain and the people who passed through their kitchen. She wrote about Millie's chickens and June's tracking and Cade's particular way of standing at the window with his second cup of coffee. She wrote about what it felt like to be 34 and 35 and 36, and to discover that the years, instead of narrowing, kept opening outward. She wrote once about Emmett Pruitt's floor, not to preserve the memory. She did not want to preserve it, but to put it somewhere outside herself, to set it on a page where it would be held still, and she could look at it clearly and then close the book and leave it there rather than carrying it. She showed Cade that page, once. He read it without interrupting, the way he read everything, with full attention and in silence. When he finished, he handed it back. "You should keep writing," he said. "I do keep writing," she said. "More than that," he said. "Other people should read this." She looked at the page, then at him. "You think so?" "I think," he said, "that there are women in a lot of different kitchens, in a lot of different towns, who are sitting on their knees on someone else's floor and can't see the door." He paused. "You've been through the door. You know where it is. That's not nothing." She held the page for a long moment. Then she put it in the drawer of the kitchen table, where it stayed for a while, and then came back out, and eventually found its way, along with the pages that came after it, into a form that could be sent to the Billings Gazette, whose editor was a woman named Frances Holden, who had been corresponding with Clara's sister, and who read what Clara sent and wrote back, "Send me more, Clara sent more." She never called herself a writer the way some people called themselves things, with performance, with a claim to status. But she wrote. She wrote from the kitchen table of a mountain homestead in Montana, with the sound of her husband in the barn and her daughters becoming their full and magnificent selves in the rooms around her. And what she wrote was true, and people read it, and some of them wrote back to say, "I know this. I have been here. How did you find the door?" She answered every letter. June turned 15 in the summer of the 4th year, and on her birthday Cade gave her a horse. Not Pearl, not one of the breeding mares, a young gelding he'd acquired from the Deaver Ranch the previous spring and spent 4 months working with in the lower pasture in the mornings before June was awake, because he had decided what he was going to do and wanted to have it right before he did it. June stood in the barn doorway looking at the gelding, dark bay, calm-eyed, clearly well-started, with the expression of someone whose face is trying to remain composed while the rest of her has entirely abandoned the effort. "He needs a name," Cade said. June looked at the horse for a long moment. She looked at Cade with the Thomas eyes that could hold a great deal. "You spent months on him," she said. "I can see it in how he stands." "He's got good ground manners," Cade agreed. "He'll need work still, but he's ready for a regular rider." "Why?" June said. "Why did you—" "Because you're 15, he said, "and because you've earned it. Those are both true reasons." June pressed her lips together briefly. It was the face she made when she was not going to cry but was making a decision about it. Then she stepped into the barn and went to the gelding and put her hand on his neck, and he dropped his head into her in the easy way of a horse that has been handled with patience. And June stood with her forehead against his neck for a moment and her eyes closed. "Meridian," she said. "I'll call him Meridian." "Why Meridian?" Millie said from somewhere behind Clara. "Because Meridian is the highest point," June said, without opening her eyes. "The point where something has come all the way up and is about to begin its way forward." Clara stood in the barn doorway with the June morning light behind her and felt the word land. The highest point. The place where something has come all the way up and is about to begin its way forward. She looked at Rowan Cade. He was watching June and the horse, and his face had the completely open expression, the one she loved most, the one that was just him, unguarded, in full possession of what he felt and not trying to manage it. He must have felt her looking because he turned, and their eyes met in the barn light, and something passed between them that was beyond conversation. The specific, wordless thing that passes between two people who have built something together and can see it standing. Clara reached out and took his hand. He took hers back. They stood like that in the barn doorway while June introduced herself to Meridian and Millie explained to the horse what his life was going to be like, and the mountain stood above all of it,
enormous and permanent and entirely its own, carrying the homestead on its slope the way mountains carry everything, without effort, without sentiment, but with the absolute reliability of stone. T. There is a thing that happens to women who survive the particular kind of diminishment that Clara survived, who walk out the other side of it with their daughters and their dignity and a document in their coat pocket, and a man who looked at them and said, "You are exactly what I want, in full, without reduction." The thing that happens is not that they forget where they came from. The forgetting would be easier, but it would also be a kind of waste, a discarding of the very material that made them. What happens instead is this: they remember clearly, and the remembering becomes useful. Clara was 37 when she understood this fully. She was at the kitchen table with her fourth composition book and a letter from Frances Holden at the Billings Gazette asking if she had considered gathering the pieces into something longer, something that could go between covers and travel to the places letters couldn't reach. Outside, the first autumn snow was coming down in the way she now loved. The announcement of it, the mountain turning its page. She could hear Cade on the porch, dealing with something that needed dealing with before the snow deepened. She could hear Millie's voice from the barn, because Millie at 11 still talked to the chickens, and had expanded this to include the horses, who she considered an underserved audience. She could hear June, 15, and growing into the full dimensions of herself, somewhere upstairs, possibly reading, possibly writing her own things in her own notebook, which she had begun keeping and which she did not share except occasionally, selectively, with Clara. Clara sat with Frances Holden's letter and thought about what it meant to gather things together and put them between covers and let them travel. She thought about the woman she had been on Pruitt's floor and whether that woman would have believed this was possible. She thought about what Rowan Cade had said 4 years ago in a snowy January field. "I want to be around when she finds out how strong she is." She pulled a clean page from the composition book and uncapped her pen and began to write. Not a letter, not a piece for the Gazette, something else. The beginning of something longer, something that started in a trading post in Harrow Creek and ended provisionally here. At this table, in this house, on this mountain, in this life that she had chosen and built and kept choosing every morning with full knowledge of what the choosing meant. She wrote the first line. The snow came down outside. Cade came in from the porch, stamped the snow off his boots, and looked at her at the table with the pen and the page. He read her face the way he had been reading her face for 4 years, which was the way you read something you have studied with love and genuine attention. "Writing?" he said. "Writing," she said. He went to the stove and poured his coffee and came and looked over her shoulder at the page. The single line on it, just the beginning of the thing, the first sentence of the story she was ready to tell. He read it. He set his hand on her shoulder, briefly, warmly, in the way that meant, "I see you. I am here. Go on." She went on. Outside, the mountain held the homestead on its slope the way it had always held it, without asking anything except presence, without offering anything except ground. The snow came down clean and white over everything. The chickens were accounted for. The horses were in. The girls were home. The fire was going. And Clara Cade, who had once been told she took up space without doing good in the world, sat at her kitchen table and filled the page and the page after it, and let the story go as far as it needed to go, which it turned out was very far indeed.